There's theologians, and then there's apologists, and then there's Sunday school puppeteers. And I'm not sure how much those classes overlap.
Welcome to the Unitarian Christian Alliance podcast, episode 38, The Making of a Trinity Nerd, with guest Dale Tuggy. I'm Mark Kane. Many Unitarian Christians who spend time on the internet doing research or listening to podcasts, the Trinities podcast, know who this character is. Dale is a unique one, boldly delving into topics fraught with mental contortionism and philosophical fanfare. Dale goes where many of us would prefer not. You may be cut from a similar cloth as Dale, with similar interests. Or you may be quite the opposite. But you know, it takes all kinds. It's one of the remarkable things about this podcast. I know both of you types are listening. That's kind of weird, but cool weird. I really was hoping I'd never have to interview Dale. All right, I'm kidding. But there's a reason why I haven't had him on yet. There are so many people you've never met. Each episode is a chance to expand your circle. And for that reason, new people fit the mold better than folks you may already know. Dale is on today because I'm trying something. I'm tying the podcast to the release of the UCA sessions, the videos. Dale presented on the first night of the UCA conference. We will be releasing that video this Friday, November 12th. This episode, then, is a chance for you to get to know this curious fellow. It will be Dale as you may not normally hear him, not in the thick of some Trinity theory. I get him laughing several times, and you get to learn how he got to where he is now. Maybe you have nerd DNA too. Well, then follow along and take notes. Not a nerd? Well, then maybe this will feel like a trip to the zoo. If you look to your left, you'll see a philosophy professor in a carefully constructed, climate-controlled habitat. The wall of books makes him feel right at home. And if you look closely behind the desk, you might see him now, scribbling furiously in the margins of a work by Kierkegaard. So Dale Tuggy, it's great to have you on. I've been trying to avoid having famous people. I did air quotes in the air.
Yeah, famous, boring people that everybody's heard plenty from and is sick to death of.
I wasn't going to say that, Dale, but I appreciate you doing that for me. Well, you've had over 330 episodes, all on the topic of the Trinity. That is a monumental achievement. How have you managed to continually find more content for this podcast?
Well, you know, there's just no end of arguments, and I have my ear to the ground of the arguments going on in the Trinitarian world.
Yeah.
Among Christian philosophers specifically, there's an ongoing quest to try to come up with a version of incarnation, two natures, that doesn't imply any contradictions or have any other ridiculous implications. And then, you know, there's this ongoing effort to try to make basically the claims in the Athanasian Creed come out consistent. There's no end of new solutions on offer. So, you know, plus a lot of my subjects are biblical, and that's just a huge subject.
Yeah.
There are a lot of difficult passages there. So I don't anticipate running out of topics anytime soon, but it's the obsession of a nerd, you know, to be that focused.
Yeah, that's true. This topic could live forever. Could. I mean, we've gone since the creeds, debating it and arguing it. If we stacked all the books trying to explain the Trinity, we might be able to get to the moon because there is a lot of material.
Well, it doesn't need to go on forever, but what's happened a couple of times is a lot of useful material in progress has been thrown away. So, you know, there was a whole bunch of ancient discussion about this stuff. All we have is what the Catholic victors have passed on. There's a whole lot of early Reformation discussion of the Trinity. A lot of it's still in Latin that nobody reads anymore. And people have forgotten about that. Then there was the failure of American Unitarianism in the 1800s. Those guys had done pretty well showing that the Trinity doesn't fit with what's in the Bible, but since they morphed into what became Unitarian Universalism, nobody cares about them anymore. So we're doing it again.
Hey.
To start from scratch again.
Well, some people will say, Dale's like a one-trick pony. He really focuses on this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you say to that?
That's a fair criticism. I mean, there's more to my life than that, but I mean, if you're looking at the podcast episodes I've released, I mean, you're like, man, when is this guy going to get sick of this stuff? Some days I do, some days I'm just like, oh, I don't want to hear one more Trinity theory,
Yeah.
They do wear you out.
When you talk about Trinity theories, you're reading these papers, you're looking into their deep stuff. I sometimes just hear them while listening to your podcast and doing other things at once. I'm like, oh man, if I had to like zero in and try to pick apart, what are they really saying here? I think I would lose my mind. So what I'm trying to say, Dale, is the world needs people with different skills because somebody's got to do it. And I know it's not me.
Yeah, it's not for everybody. When I updated my Trinity entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy several months ago,
Yeah.
I had to go out and read about 2 or 3 dozen recent papers about Trinity and incarnation.
Mm.
Yeah, it was some heavy lifting. I'm not going to say it was fun reading. It was not. Not all the material ended up in the entry. A lot of it's on the cutting room floor too. I might put that out on my blog sometime.
Do any of these papers have like dragons and adventures?
No.
No.
Sometimes they have imaginative sci-fi thought experiments that are almost that exciting.
Ooh.
I mean, one guy, Brian Leftow from Oxford, formerly of Fordham, he wrote a famous paper about his Trinity theory in which there's a rockette, those dancing girls that kick their legs up
Yeah.
when they dance.
Yeah.
She dances by herself on the stage. Then her future self travels back in time and dances with her at that original time. And then another future person gets in a time machine and comes back. So there's 3 copies of her dancing with herself, all kicking their legs up together at the same time. And this is supposed to help us understand how God can be 3 persons.
Oh.
Or it's a classic case of trying to illuminate the obscure by the even more obscure.
Well, you have to give these guys credit for trying. Anybody who has a belief, it is appropriate for them to work through their belief and try to express it.
They're trying to make it consistent with other things they know and with itself.
Yeah.
It does get a little eye-rolling sometimes, to be honest, but it's truth-seeking. They want this to be true. They don't want it to turn out to be a contradiction. They think the honor of Jesus and Christianity hinges on whether or not this can be true. And so they think they're doing God's work.
Yeah. Well, since the UCA podcast is not the Trinities podcast, would I say they stand in stark opposition? Maybe at times. But our goal here is to meet the people. I want to meet Dale Tuggy, figure out how he ended up doing what he's doing.
Okay, let's go. I was born into a church-going family. My mother had been raised as kind of a mainstream Northern Baptist, and my father was kind of a West Coast fundamentalist. They met while both of them were working for Operation Mobilization, which was an evangelistic organization that was doing missions to Europe. They kind of eloped at the last minute, and somehow they got into the charismatic movement in the 60s. And that was a big deal to them. It changed how they understood Christianity, and they got involved in this charismatic church in Dallas, Texas. That's how I ended up being raised in Dallas.
Okay.
That charismatic church had really good and really bad things about it. They did believe in all the New Testament spiritual gifts. That church underwent a bitter breakup when I was about 10, and the family went looking for a new church. We ended up in a very anti-charismatic Bible church where the leadership was associated with the arch-conservative Dallas Theological Seminary.
That's a change.
Yeah, it was a big change.
Yeah.
Again, those churches had a lot of good things about them and some bad things.
Okay.
So I had seen the charismatic side, and now I was hearing the totally anti-charismatic side from about 12 to 18. My parents, neither one of them went to a 4-year college, and I inherited some kind of anti-intellectual attitudes from my dad. He used to call seminaries cemeteries, which I think generally speaking, that's probably not fair. Maybe that applies to some, I don't know. Yeah, so when I went off to college, I only applied to and got into 2 colleges. One of them was Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. I had no idea how ironic that was going to end up being at the time.
Yes.
And then I got into BIOLA, which is this evangelical college. It's like the West Coast Wheaton, basically.
Okay.
The letters once stood for Bible Institute of Los Angeles,
Oh.
but it had morphed into a college, then into a university by the time I got there.
Hmm.
And so I ended up going off there. I just liked it. It seemed like kind of the open door that I should go through. My parents, I think, were pleased.
What does an anti-intellectual perspective look like, especially in that day?
The kind of anti-intellectualism I was exposed to, I think, was just a general disdain for theology, doesn't really believe in the value of hard thought or precise arguments.
Okay.
And the assumption is that somebody who's engaging in this kind of intellectual activity is not trusting in God. It's thought of as always a proud, haughty kind of exercise. And so it's not something that spiritual people get into.
Ah, I see. Okay.
And I had absorbed that, and I had experienced that in a couple of different kinds of churches. You don't want to be a proud person who's resistant to God's Spirit, an intellectual.
And yet you went off to college. I mean, your parents were supportive of you.
Yeah, that's true. I went off as an undeclared major, not having any idea what I was going to study. And let's see, it was the January semester after my first semester, I took an intro to philosophy class, and I just immediately loved it. I thought it was the most interesting thing in the world. The guy who taught it was this old kind of fuddy-duddy guy, but it turned out to be a really lovely person. He was very humble, and yet he had that curiosity bug that all philosophers had, curious about everything. He was very gracious and open-minded and very encouraging. And so one semester in, I was like, oh man, philosophy is the most interesting subject there is. And I took as much of it as I could.
Something happened deep in your nerdy soul.
Yeah.
You found your home.
I mean, philosophy is just what results when you keep asking questions. Whether you start in the sciences or in history or even in theology, if you just keep asking questions, pretty soon you're asking philosophical questions. They're super hard to answer, but they're also really fundamental and very, very interesting. So
That's so cool.
So when I went off to college, I had found out about these Vineyard churches, which was a new controversial thing. I think it had only been around for about 10 years.
This was about what time?
1989.
Okay.
The Vineyard were what they call third wave churches. So they believe in all the spiritual gifts, but they're neither Pentecostal nor the later charismatics. They're a little different. Interestingly, a big difference in their theology is that it's kingdom of God focused, just like, for instance, the work of Sir Anthony Buzzard.
Interesting.
But there I also encountered some anti-intellectualism here and there. I remember one time me and my roommate met this guy. I think it was at a weeknight Bible study at the church. And this guy told us with a straight face that God told him to burn all of his theology books. And we looked at each other like, maybe that happened. I don't know.
The rich young ruler who was told to sell everything he had.
Yeah.
Because he had a wealth problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe this guy had a bad taste in theology problem and God was helping him to get cured of that. Yeah, I decided that I did believe in the spiritual gifts and had some interesting experiences. And I was conflicted, though, for a couple of years because while I was falling in love with philosophy and thinking this is the most interesting thing in the world and just loving all my philosophy classes, I was interested in these spiritual gifts and just in being a spiritual Christian who has a relationship with God through Christ. For instance, I would... it was Southern California, so the weather was great all year. I used to go to this big park across the street from BIOLA, a big city park, and sit on this hill under this big pine tree with my back against a tree. Off in the distance, I could see the beautiful mountains of Southern California.
That is so picturesque.
Yeah, I would spend quality time there just praying and reading my Bible and thinking. And when I went back to BIOLA in 2014, I made a point of visiting that just to really remember old times.
Was the tree still there?
Uh-huh. Yeah, the tree and the mountain and the smog that blocks the mountain half the time.
Did you sit down and put your back against the tree?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, so I was conflicted. I think it was when I was a junior, this Christian philosopher named J.P. Moreland came to the school. He's a very interesting person, an interesting philosopher and apologist. When I first met him, I harshly judged him to be this proud intellectual spiritual nobody. He came across as really opinionated. He didn't want me to ask a bunch of irrelevant questions during class. He always had a lot to say. I'm like, well, this is not a spiritual person. This is one of those wacko intellectuals that doesn't value spiritual things.
This is what your dad warned you about.
Yeah, kind of. Not explicitly, but by his attitudes that I had picked up.
Yeah.
He used to pray every day before class to start the class. And then sometimes after praying, he would just launch off and talk about something for a while. One day in class, he basically started prophesying in class. That's what I understood it to be. Not predicting the future, but delivering this very powerful message about trusting God and following God, something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
I could recognize it as an inspired speech, and it kind of blew me away. I think I went out of class after that and was walking around the campus crying. I didn't want anybody to see me. I had tears streaming down my face because I was relieved, like, oh, you could be somebody who pursues this intellectual subject matter, but you can also be spiritual, somebody who's in touch with God. So that was encouraging to me. After that, I kind of never looked back. When I was a young evangelical going to this Bible church, I kind of assumed that, serious Christians, really spiritual people go into ministry. So I thought, well, maybe I'll, become a pastor or something. But as I got through my 4 years of BIOLA, I pretty much just wanted to be a philosophy professor.
Okay.
Nothing else seemed to make sense to me.
Okay. And that's what you went into then. You've been a professor for years.
I was a professor from 2000 to 2018 until I quit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, tell me a bit about your experience then as a professor. That's 18 years of teaching.
Well, initially, coming from BIOLA and being interested in Christian sorts of topics, it would have made sense for me to pursue like some kind of evangelical institution as a place of employment. But by the time I got through grad school, I had figured out that I did not believe in the evangelical version of scriptural inerrancy. And so this was going to be a problem. As a matter of fact, I talked myself out of a 1-year job at one evangelical institution on precisely that basis. I was up for a 1-year job at Wheaton, and they have a really strict inerrancy statement that, in the originals, it's absolutely 100% consistent. I'm looking at the Gospels, and I'm like, doesn't seem like it's 100% consistent. In conversations with people, including, I think it was a dean, some mid-level administrator, it was clear to me that a lot of the faculty just conveniently reinterpreted inerrancy into what they wanted it to be. So my interview went well. The philosophy department, or at least half of it, liked me. And, maybe this would be a good 1-year job, philosophy professor guy.
Yeah.
They were like a step away from hiring me. I had said something on my application that hinted to them that I didn't believe in full inerrancy, so they all had to ask me about it. When I explained what my views were, they seemed kind of satisfied.
Okay.
Anyway, so they're getting close to offering me a job, and this dean is emailing me, and I'm like, well, look, if I can take your statement and just interpret it how I want, then yeah, I can do that. And he's like, no, that's not good enough. But it was clear to me that that's exactly what he and others were doing, but I didn't play the game the right way. I had to say, yeah, how you interpret it, yeah, that's what I think is true.
Sounds like the Nicene Creed.
The Nicene Creed, boy, that's even harder to interpret.
I shouldn't have sent you in that path. I'm sorry. Stop that. Rewind.
The way I did grad school was I did a master's for 2 years in California at the Claremont Graduate University, and then I transferred over to Brown University on the East Coast. While I was at Claremont, I was influenced by this really wonderful Christian philosopher named Steven Davis. And, he was just encouraging to me. He taught only one class that I was in. It was a philosophy of religion class, but I absolutely loved it. And he was very gracious and helpful and encouraging behind the scenes. And I thought, well, I could do something like that. I could be a professor in a secular institution, just basically be a Christian witness in that context.
Yeah.
And be there for any Christian students that come along, but also be helpful to everybody else. So I applied to all kinds of jobs in the year 2000, and I ended up getting a job at the State University of New York in Fredonia And I was really grateful to get it. I didn't have to horse around doing temporary jobs for many years like so many PhDs have to do. I went right off to this full-time tenure track job, and I got tenure. Eventually, I was disillusioned with the job. The pay was poor. The school culture was shockingly anti-intellectual. Like, I was just a true believer in curiosity and knowledge and investigating all fields and helping college students develop the life of the mind. Like, I was a true believer in that. The school was becoming very politically correct and just did not want to think about certain topics. And I was like, this isn't what I signed up for.
Okay.
So I loved my philosophy colleagues, but I kind of couldn't stand the administration. For about 4 years, I was basically praying for an escape hatch. From about 2014 to the end of 2017, I was looking for a way out. And, I thought that would take the form of maybe getting a better professor job somewhere, because that's all I'd ever done. That's all I ever really wanted to do.
Yeah.
But as it turned out, God opened up this other door to come and do this totally non-academic job here in Tennessee. It seemed like the right thing to do. So we made that big change and haven't really regretted it or looked back.
Interesting. So I know you've talked about your transformation from Unitarianism to Trinitarianism in other podcasts. That's one of the main things about your story. But on the timeline of the events that you described, where did that transformation take place? And then maybe just give me a short summary of how it happened.
Basically, what happened was when I was a grad student at Brown University, I read a book by a Christian philosopher named Richard Swinburne, who was trying to make sense of the Trinity. He basically comes up with tritheism. That's one way to make sense of it. Kind of like, well, maybe you just got to get the right kind of tritheism or something. I don't know. This kind of makes sense. But I wasn't totally satisfied with it. And then in the bowels of the Brown Library, when I was nerding out, just like looking at books, I found the works of Samuel Clarke, the famous Anglican intellectual and younger friend of Sir Isaac Newton. And he wrote this famous book in 1712 called The Scripture Doctrine of the Trinity. And the Scripture Doctrine of the Trinity turns out to be the one God just as the Father alone. So it's really a Unitarian work. But he believes in pre-existence. The Son and Spirit are lesser divine beings.
Okay.
So, that's interesting. And he shows very forcefully in Scripture that the one God is the Father. So that kind of stuck with me. He also shows that other early Christian authors think the same thing. When I became a professor, I started realizing that Christian philosophers had started to spin out all these different ways of interpreting the traditional Trinity language to try to make it come out consistent. So I rolled up my sleeves. Okay, there's got to be a view that makes sense here. So I started reading all of this and going through all of them.
So it was a side pursuit. You're working now. This is at your time in New York.
Yeah, it was a side pursuit. I was desperately preparing, new philosophy of science lectures my first year, driving through the snow at 2 a.m. after I was done getting my lecture ready for the 9 o'clock class. But no, I was thinking through it, and it drove me back to the Bible. And reading Clarke also alerted me to the fact that, there were these Protestants who just set aside the Trinity as not a biblical doctrine, just like they set aside the papacy and praying to saints and monks and nuns and lots of other Catholic things.
Yeah.
So from the early 2000s, I was kind of re-examining the Bible, and I believed in pre-existence for quite a while. I didn't, quote, come out as a Unitarian until I think it was about 2009. And it didn't go over very well with my Christian philosopher peers. It's not that people said anything. It's like I didn't get invited to things. And sometimes they would tell other people not to pay any attention to my work. But I knew I was doing good work, For philosophers and Christian philosophers who wanted to explore the topic, the things I was doing were helpful. I knew because I would get good feedback from them.
Okay.
But then as time went on, even though I was teaching all these other subjects, including world religions, I kept going down that publishing route and publishing more and more stuff on these clashing Trinity theories. I've published probably more than just about anybody, I think. Most people don't specialize in it.
Yeah.
It's not exactly a topic that philosophy departments smile upon. But my atheist colleagues didn't really care. They thought it was interesting enough. They would give me helpful comments sometimes on my papers.
So at what point did you start the podcast?
I started the podcast in 2013 in the summer, but I had already been blogging since I think it was about 2006 at trinities.org. And initially I was just, hey guys, look at all these Trinity theories.
Mm-hmm.
People don't know about this outside philosophy, so I wanted to kind of bring that to the masses. And that's kind of what I was trying to do with the podcast, was just to raise awareness about these philosophical discussions of Christian doctrines and also the history of it. I was reading a ton of the church fathers at this time too, trying to figure out how we got ourselves here. One of my first episodes is on the Athanasian Creed, for instance. And then other episodes zing around between history, interviews of scholars, and my own excessive opinionating.
Well, your podcast is certainly unique. It kind of is your nerdness made flesh, if I might say.
Mm-hmm.
And what I enjoy about your podcast is within that topic of the Trinity, you have quite a bit of variety. Sometimes it's very up in the head.
Yeah.
I have a hard time following it, but I figure I'm going to get through it and see what I can glean from it. And then sometimes you have the Logic Bot 3000. When you insert humor into your podcast, it's like a little nugget of funny. And I get a kick out of it because it's not always.
Yeah, no, usually it's as serious as death and taxes. That's just kind of my personality. But, there's a wacky side too there that comes out once in a while. It's hard because you have to treat people doing something serious with respect. You can't bust out a bunch of jokes like when you're interviewing some guy about his recent book.
Yeah.
But, humor can be a very potent tool of argument when it's carefully used.
Yeah.
But it's hard to carefully use it,
Yeah.
Otherwise, people will just think you're an idiot who's just mocking.
I'm more likely to go there than you are, so I might be the idiot.
Well, but you're not dealing constantly with people with opposed views, Humor is more in place amongst friends who see more eye to eye. If you start trying to goof on the views of some Trinitarian scholar, they're going to take it like you're just mocking them, basically. And I don't want to do that. I want to be a host who respects people and treats serious work seriously.
Yeah.
But there can still be a place for humor. Usually it's when I'm not talking about somebody specific, like the Trinity Club orientation episode. That's one of my favorites.
That is good. What number is that?
That's Trinity's podcast 232, Trinity Club orientation.
I would like to propose a rating system, Dale, something that you could put on every podcast so that us more average listeners can pull it up and be like, okay, this one is rated R, restricted for severe nerds. And then something like PG, like pretty good. And then
F for funny, I am for interminable metaphysics.
Something for you to think about, Dale. Consider that helpful feedback for you in the future. Well, with 330 plus episodes, any person can just scroll through and read the descriptions and know, oh, this actually might be interesting for me. That's the beauty of having such a large pool of content. Nobody's obligated to sit through every one of your episodes.
Yeah, I think each week I get a lot more listens to my big catalog of back episodes than I get to the new episode. People are picking and choosing, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Most of it's not interconnected, so you have to listen to a bunch of it for it to make sense.
It's not a serial story.
No.
A drama.
No.
No.
It's not that interesting, Mark.
Well, I'm a fan of the Logic Bot 3000. Whenever he shows up, I'm right there with you, Dale. Well, the latest episode you had was, I was going to recommend anybody who listens to me would enjoy listening to you talk with Jeff Deuble about his Christ Before Creeds book.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with him. He's a godly Christian man, and I think he really put a lot of love into that book.
Yeah.
He's not just trying to have a theological argument, but he's trying to be edifying to the Christian reader.
Yeah, that one would be rated E for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited for the future of what that book is going to do. I think a lot of Trinitarians are going to appreciate his style, and a lot of Unitarians will be happy to hand that across the table to someone they're chatting with and say, here, just check this out.
A lot of the episodes I do, I fully realize that these are not for most people. For instance, the one I did right before that, 334, Who Do You Say I Am? This is a big, heavy argument for seeing the Bible our way. But, there might be that one guy going into grad school the earlier version of me who really does care about arguments and really wants to follow reason, follow the evidence where it goes, a person like that could be very affected by an episode like that, maybe 5 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
So I've released arguments into the wild a lot faster than they have any discernible effect on anybody. But then occasionally I meet people who say, yeah, I've listened to every single episode. And occasionally I'd meet people who were somewhat like me, that they were educated Trinitarians. They basically learned to take our side seriously through some of these episodes.
It is our goal as the UCA to both promote the Unitarian view and to help people connect. And promoting the Unitarian view does include very well-crafted information that people can truly chew on and mull over.
Occasionally people give me feedback and they're irritated that I'm not basically mocking Trinitarians, calling them tritheists who worship a pagan three-headed monster, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that would have helped. When I was a Trinitarian, if somebody just starts mocking me, then I would just say, oh, they don't really understand why I think this. So I'm trying to give arguments, like in that episode I mentioned, this recent one, that don't beg the question. That is, they don't assume what needs to be proved.
Right.
So we want to say, let's start with a bunch of assumptions that even my Trinitarian friends should agree with. And then let's throw in some basic facts about the Bible and history and logic. Let's evaluate this properly.
Yeah.
The old lazy objection against us by apologists nowadays is that we're always, quote, assuming Unitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of my arguments very explicitly do not assume Unitarianism.
Yeah.
Like if you think that's assuming what needs to be proved, you're not paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Trinitarians have not rebutted these arguments. They should take a crack at them.
Yeah. I haven't had anybody rebut my puppet show either yet, Dale. What? I'm like, I want that. Is that selfish of me? Maybe it is.
Does the rebuttal have to be in puppet form?
Oh, see, they might assume that, and that's why they haven't tackled it yet.
Because there's theologians, and then there's apologists, and then there's Sunday school puppeteers. And I'm not sure how much those classes overlap.
So currently, then, you're still in Tennessee. You participate in the worship music at your church.
Yeah, I love it. I play some pretty, C- quality electric guitar. Like I can't solo, but I just, hit some power chords and try to help the music move along. I've been participating in worship music teams almost since I was a freshman or sophomore in college.
Oh, wow.
Whenever I could, I would play bass or acoustic guitar. For a few years, I did drums, but I wasn't any good at it. I'm not any good at electric guitar either, but I can keep the beat and not make it worse. So I'm really blessed to be a part of a really great worship team right now at Higher Ground Church. I absolutely love it. It's a great way to connect with God and help other people to connect with God.
Well, Dale, I appreciate that you took a few minutes to chat. I hope that this is their chance to kind of get to know you a little bit better, because when they hear the presentation that's going to come out in a few days, it won't just be an academically solid, carefully thought through presentation. It will be a presentation by Dale, who we now know, and like, oh yeah, I know this guy. Let's hear what he had to say. That's my hope.
Yeah, I will be in full history nerd mode, though. So
yeah,
there is a little bit of humor, though. I do bust out a meme from the year 2000.
Yes, you did.
Which, if you're old enough to have been on the internet in 2000, you may enjoy.
Do you want to give us just a small taste of what will be coming in this presentation?
Yeah, it seems like any educated Trinitarian thinks that John 1 is their go-to passage. How could anybody make sense of this other than that there are multiple persons in God?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I used to think back in the day. And after 20 years of thinking about it, I think that's really upside down. And using a bunch of recent Bible scholarship, I think when you understand it in its first century context and understand it against a wisdom literature background, there's actually nothing Trinitarian at all about it. And so I'm giving a reading of John 1 where John is building on earlier themes that his audience would have been familiar with. In almost the whole passage, it's not that he's just cutting and pasting or anything, but in almost the whole passage, you can find earlier parallels of these ideas. I'm trying to show how John 1 would have been comprehensible when it was written. before anybody had started to suggest that there are three persons in God.
Yeah, cool. Well, we look forward to that, Dale, and I appreciate the hard work you put into it.
Thanks, Mark. I have to say I love the podcast. This is one of the very few podcasts I never, ever miss an episode of. And as evidenced by my text messages to you, I usually gobble it down like an hour after it comes out, or at least the same day. So keep up the great work. I really, really appreciate what you're doing to build community.
Yeah.
Just being able to meet the people you had on was a huge treat at the conference.
Oh, yeah.
And I look forward to having that experience again someday, God willing.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Dale. The first session will be showing up on the Unitarian Christian Alliance YouTube channel this Friday, entitled What John 1 Meant. And now you've met the guy behind it. We plan on releasing a session each month. I'm hoping to have an interview with each presenter before it releases. But it's just a plan. It may not happen each time. But it did happen today. Now, here's something else I'm going to try. There were quite a few people there who weren't as accustomed to submerging themselves into theological presentations like this. Some of them may have had questions of a more practical type. When you've heard the presentation, you, likewise, might have some practical or pragmatic questions about the content. I'd like to try and have a Q&A here on the podcast. Here's how it would work. Many of you will find some time to hear Dale's presentation, and some of you were at the conference and already did hear it. You probably can think of a few things you may want to ask. Here's what I need. I'd like you to select a question or two that would be meaningful not just to you, but also to a wider audience, a diverse UCA podcast audience. Something like, my friend keeps going on and on about how obvious it is that John 1 is about the Trinity. You shared a lot of examples of writings that existed at that time that have similar style with John 1. Which one might you suggest I share with my friend, and why? Notice how the question involves your daily life, your interactions, practical stuff for living as a Unitarian in a Trinitarian majority world. That's what I'm kind of looking for. It is an experiment, admittedly, but I'm prone to try things. Over the next several weeks, if you do get to listen, maybe you'll have a question. You can email it to me, podcast@unitarianchristianalliance.org, or you can record your question and email the recording. I also have a link in the show notes called Record, which you can click and then record the question that way. I don't know if I'll get one question or a dozen. Probably very few. So don't hold back thinking, oh, everyone else is already going to give me questions. It's likely I'll not get very many. I'll take the questions and select the ones that I think would work well in a follow-up podcast. I may not use them all. Some people might ask some really brainy, big-worded, detailed questions, which will not be of interest to many listeners. Like, I can imagine Brandon Duke, also a nerd, asking something like,
Dr. Tuggy seems to often prefer to lean on context rather than grammatical considerations in evaluating ambiguous passages. Is this methodological for him? And if so, why?
I'd have to say no on that. Let's climb back down from the ivory towers and get our fingers in the dirt. You send some questions, I gather them up, and then at the end of an episode, several weeks from now, I will find a way, or I will try to find a way, to get some answers, perhaps from Dale himself, or maybe a willing stand-in. I just want it to be helpful, and I'm all up for trying things. Just a reminder that I send an email each week when an episode is released. I include extra thoughts, maybe some behind-the-scenes details about the episode, or notes about what is coming up. I also try to email you when I miss a week, so you know I'm okay, and that I didn't get pulled out of this timeline and inserted into 1988, where I ended up dancing next to myself in a high school musical in order to demonstrate how the Trinity may be true. I emailed these thoughts to the people who signed up for the UCA podcast email list, a very select and prestigious group. There's a link in the show notes, or you can find a sign-up at podcast.unitarianchristianalliance.org. In each email, I even include all the links to the episode's resources and the scripture references. Thank you to the many who attended the UCA conference and gave us feedback in the survey. We very much appreciated your time. One remark we got in the surveys was from Beth Lansing from Ohio. I appreciated the scholarship evident in the theological presentations, and I benefited from the spirit of inquiry and humility that characterized every conversation I had with people I have never met before. Coming from a Christadelphian background with a wide and diverse network of brethren around the world, I was humbled by the many people there who have come out of the Trinitarian belief system and who have experienced hardship as a result. Their zeal for God's truth and love of His Word was an inspiration for me. Thank you, Beth. I look forward to meeting with you again. And thank you, Dale.
Yeah.
I appreciate your work and your commitment to the effort. I couldn't resist. At this rate, I'm going to have to list her as a co-host. May God bless you in your truth pursuits. I hope this podcast serves you well.